Hello and welcome to CorpWatch. I'm Prathap Chatterjee, and I'm joined today by Pascoe Sabido, who's with Corporate Europe Observatory, and he's in Glasgow right now in Scotland at the climate change negotiations, the 26th in a series. Um, so Pascoe, why don't we start with you? Tell us who Corporate Europe Observatory is and what the Climate Change Convention is all about.
Yeah, thank you. I work with Corporate Europe Observatory. We're a Brussels-based lobby watchdog. We sort of try and expose corporate lobbying, and I particularly work on climate, so the oil and gas industry. A lot happens at the Brussels level, so in the EU, but I also work on UN climate talks where this is the 26th and we are not going anywhere in terms of tackling the climate. So we've had a campaign for many years to try and kick out the fossil fuel industry and other big polluters from the talks. So that's what I'm here doing. I guess making noise, bringing out research, running campaigns to try and sort of build support and pressure to create a firewall between fossil fuel companies and the UNFCCC, but also at national level. So I can get into that later, but yeah, this is what we're doing.
So just to rewind a little bit, the Climate Change Convention itself was signed in 1992, 154 countries. And in the convention, they agreed to meet every year, and they met literally all over the world. They had a big protocol, I think in 1997 in Kyoto, in Japan, where I happen to live, and then in Paris in 2015. These were sort of major steps forward, at least in the media. And now then Glasgow. And the idea is to get countries to commit together to ways of however, over time, in fact, this has changed, and it's not just countries at the table, it's more than that, and we'll get to that in just a second. But you hear all this talk of, originally, I remember back in 1992, they talked of reaching 1990 levels by the year 2000. And I just checked on the NOAA website, and we're now at 47% above 1990 levels. So in terms of progress, it doesn't seem like we're doing very well. And there's another number, 350, we're supposed to reach 350 parts per million to be sustainable. And it's, I just checked, 417, I think. So why is that so? Why has no progress been made? Maybe, you could give us a flavor, since you've been to now 10 of these meetings. What goes on then? Why is it that things are getting worse? And clearly it's not just these meetings, but yeah, give us a sense of who's there and what happens. And we'll then watch a couple of videos from inside that you filmed. So, but
Great.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, to start with the very famous phrase, it's the economy, stupid. I mean, this is why we're not tackling climate change, because climate change is a symptom of our current economic model, a sort of neoliberal capitalist model based on extractivism, based on fossil fuel extractivism at its core. And tackling climate change would mean tackling those economic interests, tackling the business models of many of the companies who have caused the problem, from oil companies through to big agriculture. We have in here in the talks, you have so we've sort of got big fertilizer companies, plastic companies. I mean, any sector. We have aviation, we have shipping. They're all in here. And tackling climate change would mean, yeah, I guess them losing lots of money. So unfortunately, we have not seen progress, but it's worth pointing out. I mean, it is the economy, but it's not just here. So this is a symptom, really. The lack of progress is a symptom of what happens at national level. And the lack of progress we're seeing at national level is because of the close relationship between these very same companies and our governments. So, I mean, we've had the Exxon New campaign. We now have Total, the French big oil and gas company. Turns out it's known since the 70s as well, if not earlier. Shell New. So many of these companies, along with car companies and mining companies, have been at the talks since 1992 through organizations like the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And they've been blocking, delaying, weakening climate action. So this is why we're still where we are. You could say it's due to power imbalance. We do not have the power at national level, at international level, to see change. And I guess that's been this big struggle. How do we build that power to hold governments to account and to ensure that they listen to people over profit, putting the planet first? And at the moment, we do not have that.
And Something I saw recently, a couple of days ago, which really shocked me, was the number of lobbyists, corporate lobbyists, fossil fuel lobbyists, that are actually in the talks, and the number that I think, I forget who dug the number up, but it's 503 lobbyists are present in the talk, and that's bigger than any national level delegation. So the biggest delegation is Brazil, and I think it's 473. And the fossil fuel lobbyists, there's over 500. How did they get in?
How do they get in? So firstly, the research was done by ourselves,
Okay.
by Corporate Europe Observatory, along with Corporate Accountability, Glasgow Calls Out Polluters, and then Global Witness. And yeah, we looked at the sort of participant list, went through and sort of classified who's a fossil fuel lobbyist and who's not, based on whether they have a significant interest in the industry, as well as whether they're part of a trade association which is explicitly promoting fossil fuels. How do they get in? They get in because, I mean, some of them have been invited by governments. You know, Russia has brought in 50 fossil fuel lobbyists, the likes of Gazprom, the likes of Novatek, who's sort of drilling for gas and setting up LNG terminals in the Arctic, new ones now. But Canada brought in Suncor, a sort of a tar sands company based in Alberta. So we're seeing them coming in partly via governments, but also they're allowed in as what are called observers. So they're here walking these halls the same way that I'm allowed in, and that's why we've been pushing for a long time for a conflict of interest policy at the UN climate talks to ensure they don't get in, because I mean, it's a very simple thing. Those trying to burn down the table shouldn't have a seat at it.
So some of them actually have official delegate badges, so they represent Canada, and they can sit in on the actual negotiations, speak on behalf of the Brazilian government and the Canadian government.
Yes, I mean, I don't think they would speak on behalf of them. I mean, even it's it's what's called a pink badge. So you go in. I haven't got my badges over there, but you go in and you get given a pink badge. I have a yellow badge because I'm seen as an observer, and a pink badge is a government badge, and that allows you into negotiations, whereas I might be shut out. It allows you into many other spaces. And what we have seen, for example, the likes of Chevron in the past, has been attending Canadian government meetings. So when they're discussing the negotiations, they're discussing their strategy, they've attended these meetings. So whilst I wouldn't say they speak on behalf of countries, or not say for Canada and others, they are sort of very, very involved in what's going on in other countries. I mean, this is, I guess having a very frank conversation here. The likes of Canada, the likes of the EU have huge amounts of resources to bring hundreds of people. So they will bring lots of negotiators. Smaller countries who might have a national state oil company, often they don't have those resources. So you do see state oil companies sometimes speaking on behalf of countries, and someone in the ministry will also be part of that oil company, and they might be involved in negotiations. So when it comes to public companies, it's a little bit different, but private companies, will be in there, but unlikely to be talking on behalf of countries.
So let's actually take a look inside the halls of the negotiations. Pascoe and Corporate Europe Observatory have been producing a series of daily updates, which you should check out on their website. Actually, before we do that, I want to pop up a little banner here so you can see where to go. That's Corporate Europe Observatory's web link, so you can go there and get all the coverage, including the videos we're about to show. There's 8 of them so far. We won't show all, but we'll show a couple. Let's start at the beginning, the first day, when Pascoe arrived, and you get a sense of the convention hall and some of the delegate rooms too. So let's take a look. Oops, sorry. That's a still from they look very similar. So hang on a second.
Hi, welcome to the first CEO COP diary. We're here at COP26, as you can see, in Glasgow. This is where countries are coming together to see if we can keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees. Not looking likely, it has to be said at the moment. This is it's been a packed day. We began with the UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak coming to give a speech all about private finance. He's handing the agenda over to the biggest banks financing fossil fuels, which is not particularly positive, but there was a really cool protest organised to make sure that our voices were heard.
Some of the activists went to the plenary over there where Rishi Sunak was speaking, and Rishi Sunak's security guards pointed out our activists and told the UN security to remove them.
Where Rishi himself was terrified and kicked all of the sort of UK youth out of the plenary when he was giving his speech. We next up had a toxic tour, a net zero toxic tour.
We need action that is backed up by the urgency that the climate crisis demands.
Let's come together, look at what works for us, and then push this agenda, and also demand our government to take action and not be deceived by the language, by the bogus language and the hypocrisy of the global north government.
Really cool to have loads of frontline communities and campaigners talking about their own experiences, fighting back against net zero, fighting back against the companies who are pushing it. Wasn't quite sure if we'd be able to do it, as it's not really within the rules, but we got away with it. And then finished up by a bit of a letter handing along with Fossil Free Politics Coalition. Calling for recognition that actually there's a fundamental conflict of interest between what the fossil fuel industry wants and what the rest of us want to try and tackle climate change and keep temperatures below 1.5. So we're calling for a conflict of interest policy, and that was handed into the UK, EU and US, as well as calling for a meeting and telling them we're watching you, and we're going to be seeing throughout this COP how that goes.
And we're back. I'm, oops, sorry, hang on. Let me get rid of that there. Okay. I'm Pratham Chatterjee with CorpWatch, and Pascoe Sabido from Corporate Europe Observatory joins. He is at the Climate Change Talks, 26th Climate Change, 26th, what does COP stand for?
Conference of the Parties.
Conference of the Parties, thank you. And when you arrived, you brought along reports on what was happening. And I was wondering if you could maybe tell us a little about those reports. I'll pop up a couple of them here. Here's the first one. It's about revolving doors. So walk us through what this report is about. Who is it about?
Yeah, to give the top line, I mean, first we'll explain what a revolving door, the revolving door is. So what we looked into were cases since COP21, so since this monumental climate change agreement in Paris, which is the Paris Agreement, which is what much of the negotiating is on now. Since then, we looked at how many people have gone from 6 of Europe's biggest oil and gas companies to work for government, or vice versa. And that's what the revolving door is, sort of to going from the private sector to the public sector, or vice versa, from the public sector to the private sector. And often we see it, I mean, at all levels of government it happens. So, for example, the person that we looked into here from Equinor, which is a Norwegian state oil and gas company, has hired an ex-cabinet minister who in 2019 was in Boris Johnson's cabinet. She's called Amber Rudd, and she's at these talks on behalf of Equinor, presenting their agenda, talking to our old colleagues. So the revolving door is a really key lobbying tool for companies and corporations to get their voices heard and to make sure they know exactly what's going on the inside. These are people with incredible little black books, contact books. They also know the process inside out. So having an ex-minister or ex-prime minister, as we've seen in some cases, is incredibly powerful and really enhances your lobbying abilities. So the findings from this report, we found that since COP21, there have been more than 70 cases of revolving door. So more than 70 revolving door cases between 6 of Europe's biggest oil and gas companies and their lobby groups with governments. So we go through and chart some of them, some of the biggest cases, such as Amber Rudd, who is here at COP26. I'm really showing that we need to close the revolving door. I mean, if we're going to really tackle fossil fuel industry influence, both at the UN talks, but also in the EU and at national level and local level, then one of the key things is closing the revolving door. So that's one of the planks of our campaign called Fossil Free Politics. The report was produced by the Fossil Free Politics campaign, which is sort of more than 200 organizations across Europe and I think internationally who are calling for a conflict of interest policy and a firewall to ultimately cut the fossil fuel industry out of our politics And this is based on a brilliant precedent from the Tobacco Treaty, from the tobacco talks. They realized, the World Health Organization realized, that to achieve the ambition they needed to really regulate tobacco and to stop people smoking, it was impossible with the tobacco industry present and involved. So they created something called Article 5.3 in the sort of technical jargon of the United Nations Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And this Article 5.3 was in effect a firewall. It recognized the sort of fundamental and irreconcilable conflict of interest between what the tobacco industry wants, which is people to carry on smoking, public health, which is people to stop smoking. When you have profit versus public health, it was seen as actually impossible to reconcile. So they created a firewall to protect public health policymakers, those in our ministries of health, etc., from the tobacco industry. And that applied not just at the UN level, but also at national level for every country that signed up. So I think most countries have signed up. Of course, the USA has not. But for example, the EU has, which means the EU has also implemented this across its member states. So in the Netherlands, in Germany. So yeah, we're using this great example of how do we create a firewall between public policy making, between our decision makers and lobbyists, and we're sort of applying it to the fossil fuel industry because we believe it's the same logic, the same rationale agrees in terms of this fundamental and irreconcilable conflict of interest when ultimately we have very little time left to be tackling climate change. And so urgency demands that we do have a firewall put in place. So we were also here handing in, you saw in the first video, we were handing in a letter, a sort of open letter signed by more than 130 organizations to the UK government, who's the president of these talks, to the EU, to the European Commission, and to the UNFCCC, calling for recognition of this conflict of interest and calling for a firewall, as well as closing the revolving door. So presenting the research from the revolving door report. But yeah, that's I guess one of the planks, but by no means the only plank of this firewall policy.
It's the UN has implemented this before. Let me pop up the second report that I pulled, which is the financiers of polluters in charge. And this is more than just being about the fossil fuel companies. We typically think of the oil companies, but the banks and the private equity groups, etc., that give the money to companies to drill for oil. That's what this is about, I take it.
Yeah, I mean, so what this report, this is by my colleague Kenneth Ha, who has brilliant insight into what the financial industry is up to. And he found, looking sort of this year, just seeing how this COP is being used to hand over the finance agenda to private finance. And what that means is there's a commitment since Copenhagen back in 2009 to provide 100 billion per year from rich countries to poorer countries to tackle sort of climate change, to transition their economies away from fossil fuels, to install renewables, to do other sort of adaptation, mitigation, sort of reducing emissions as well as adapting to the impacts of climate change. And that money is not materialized. What has materialized is mainly in the form, more than 70% is in the form of loans rather than grants, which means it's loading debt onto these countries. Mm-hmm. And what we've seen at COP26 has been a real push from the UK presidency to bring in the private sector, to bring in private sector financing, to turn climate change into a business opportunity. And this is how it's being presented. And so we've seen this year the creation of the architecture to do so. We've seen frameworks being created, alliances being created, and they've been led by someone called Mark Carney, who used to be the what's called the governor of the Bank of England here in the UK, and he was previously the governor of the Bank of Canada. And since then, he's continued to work for private finance after leaving. And he's the UK's the UN's high-level champion on climate finance, and the UK government, Boris Johnson, in fact, the Prime Minister's a special advisor on climate finance. And what he's been doing is bringing together all of his private sector banking friends and putting them in charge. So we're seeing the creation of various alliances. One in particular that's worth highlighting is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And that's sort of trying to bring together lots of these different net zero alliances, which is, I guess, private sector alliances for reducing emissions. I can talk about net zero in a moment. And Glasgow, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero is looking at what it says, it's looking at, okay, so how do we change the financial markets and the financial system to tackle climate change? But by doing so, the framework being created, and what's being created by Mark Carney and others, is basically bringing in the likes of BlackRock, the likes of HSBC, the likes of Citigroup, as well as insurance giants like AXA, and asking them to lead the way. So we're asking the same asset managers like BlackRock, the same banks like HSBC, and the same insurance companies who are all financing fossil fuels, deforestation, other climate wrecking practices. And we're asking these climate wrecking banks to design the system that's going to tackle climate change, that's going to channel private finance into climate change, into sort of good practices. It's not going to happen. What this is like the classic move of putting the foxes in charge of the hen house, asking, these banks, expecting them to move away from fossil fuels. We've already seen in their own plans, their own sort of 2050 net zero plans, they are not moving away from fossil fuels. They're not reducing their investments. So there's two things. One is this is not going to channel money away from fossil fuels. In fact, this is legitimizing the role of these banks and their fossil fuel investments in the climate change talks. And the second thing this is doing, which is really important to point out, is it's weakening the entire UN multilateral system. It's trying to undermine the government commitment for public finance to pay back climate debt, what's called climate reparations, because you think countries like my own in the UK, the EU, the US, they've got rich off digging up and burning fossil fuels. I mean, that's how they developed. And we don't currently have the atmospheric space to allow all countries to follow that development pathway. So they have a debt to pay for having taken up the atmospheric space to countries in the global south. And they should be paying that debt as well as reducing their emissions. And instead of paying that debt, what we're seeing is they're looking to the banks to say, oh, well, they're going to provide private finance. We've heard a figure. So there's a 100 billion figure a year. It's what was legally obliged to provide. They're not doing so. But we've had during these talks a figure of around 6 trillion is what's needed to honestly tackle climate change every year. And they're looking to the private sector to do that, to the same banks, the same asset managers, the same insurance companies currently profiting from climate change and fueling climate change. They're turning to them to sort of do it. So it's quite scary. It's undermining multilateralism. It's giving the banks more power. And there's going to be where's the accountability? Who's going to hold these banks accountable? And it's been called by my colleague Kenneth Haar as the biggest greenwashing meeting in history, the biggest finance greenwashing meeting in history. So this is a whole new level that we've not seen before in terms of the involvement of the banks and how they're being put in the driving seat.
So you mentioned who it is that's going to be holding these companies accountable, and I thought that might be a nice little segue to your report from day 3, which is the people in the streets. I mean, at the end of the day, it sounds like in the halls of the Conference of Parties, the delegates are the delegations are infiltrated. The governments don't have the ability or the power to do things. So it will be up to the people to do something about it. And you've been filming outside the halls in the streets of Glasgow. So I thought we could just play a short video from the third day, probably about less than a week ago, that you put together for Corporate Europe Observatory. So let's play that now.
We're back home in our apartment after another exhausting day in Glasgow for COP26. The day kicked off with a youth strike for climate. Incredible scenes, up to 20,000 people in the streets of Glasgow with the most creative banners. Finished at a rally on George Square. Some really cool speeches which we're bringing out. We're going to bring them out on video. Check our website, check our Facebook and Twitter, particularly Greta's speech.
As they continue to expand fossil fuel infrastructure, opening up new coal mines, coal power plants, granting new oil licenses and still refusing to do even the bare minimum, like delivering on the long-promised climate finance for loss and damage to the most vulnerable and least responsible countries. This is shameful. Some people say that we are being too radical. But the truth is that they are the ones who are radical.
Now, I popped off back into negotiations to fight against the horrible big polluters and corporate power that's there. We were organising an action with groups from India, Bangladesh, Nigeria, the US, calling out carbon markets, net zero, their full solutions, and why we're not getting anywhere at COP26.
There's nothing in these talks that make any sense in terms of the solutions. We need a just transition that stops commodifying the earth. No more solutions, no carbon markets.
This is, Friday, end of the first week. We've got a whole nother week ahead of us. So yeah, it's really important. So keep tuned in.
Great video again, a great really sense of what's happening in Glasgow, not something that you'd get on the mainstream media. You wouldn't see those pictures. You see discussions of 40 countries signing agreements. You don't get a sense of who it is that's opposing there, who it is that's organizing. But yeah, I was wondering if you want to say a bit more about how, what people are doing. I understand there's a place where people can meet, and there are speakers who come from around the world who are explaining some of these issues and helping come up with strategies to do something about it. Did you want to speak a bit about that, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, because there's this crazy contrast between inside the negotiations and outside. So what we saw there, that was Friday. There was a big Fridays for Future demo. Saturday was a huge demo as well. More than a sort of 150,000 people in the streets of Glasgow. And that's where, I guess, there's people from around the world come to these talks. And a completely different energy, but actually quite a lot of that does make it into the talks. There are spaces, like you say, to be meeting, to be strategizing, but then there's also spaces, I call them organized dissent, where you are able to sort of call out what's going on in the negotiations. So there we had speakers from indigenous communities, from the US, from the Indigenous Environment Network, from Sustain Us, a US group, basically calling out what's going on the inside. So it is, yeah, I guess it is a chance to be able to make these things heard. They're not often in the negotiations. For me, it's a really powerful place because sometimes you can get stuck in your silos. I'm based in London. My office is in Brussels, and it's very European, and actually remaining connected to international movements, to those on the front lines. This is people already feeling the impacts of climate change, people having their lands taken, fighting back, not for sort of a technical point or a bracket in a negotiation, but fighting for their lives, for their livelihoods, for their families, their territories. And meeting these people, working with these people and organizing together is a hugely inspiring thing. And I think it's one of the things that, despite being my 10th, slightly depressing to remember or realize it's been my 10th climate negotiation, they're the people who really make it worthwhile, and be able to bring that then back into our campaigning in Brussels, to not lose touch with climate change, not being just a technical issue. I mean, that's what climate justice is about who's profiting, who's being impacted, who the solutions are going to benefit, and who they're going to, who's going to be paying for them. And these are really important questions that, I guess you said, 40 countries have signed some agreement on coal or on finance or whatever's come out, and you won't hear these voices. So being able to raise these voices up is really important, and then bring them back to Brussels for the rest of the year and keep these international connections. So there is, despite the sort of what can be a very depressing time in the negotiations, there is still a lot of inspiration through allies. Yeah.
I wanted to play one more video, and that's actually, I think, from yesterday, which is actually where these worlds collide, where activists go and confront the companies. So I thought that's an appropriate and logical follow-up to that. So let's play that, and then we'll wrap up with some suggestions of what people can do to make a change in their own lives. So let's play that one right here.
So end of Wednesday, we're here back in the centre of Glasgow. It's been another eventful day, but it kicked off, in fact, last night, 1 a.m. this morning. There were some really cool projections onto the COP itself with anti-methane messages.
Our governments need to stop importing methane and commit to leaving greenhouse gases in the ground where they belong.
Partly because the methane pledge that's come out of here is complete rubbish. And maybe when you're watching this, the EU will have just released its new PCI list with 27 new projects, gas projects, which definitely shouldn't be doing. It's quite cool. And then today had a press conference talking about our new research, talking about how fossil fuels is finally in the text for the first time, but coal, not gas or oil. And that's because, of course, the gas lobby is pretty powerful with BP and Shell and the likes. And then this afternoon, there's some the youth took over. Basically, big march through the conference hall, ended up with a huge demands and shouting outside the plenary. And then, lo and behold, who was speaking? BP and Gazprom.
No more lies! Keep it in the ground!
We're hosting or speaking at an event inside the negotiations. So along with quite a few youth groups, we got involved and disrupted it and made sure they knew we were watching them. So it's been a really cool day. I'm signing off for the evening. It's only Wednesday. There's more to come. Probably more meetings tonight, to be honest. But I will see you tomorrow.
And that was last night. So you're back at home, back at the apartment, but about to head out again. Let's talk a little bit about solutions. And I've just, for people who have followed this far, I wanted to pop up a link to where people can learn more, see the rest of the videos to come the next couple of days. This will go on technically till Friday, but it can last even longer than that. Sometimes the negotiations go into the weekend. So this could be another 3 or 4 days of actions and protests and negotiations. And in theory, they'll come up with an answer and a solution and an agreement. We know it won't be very strong. So what is it that people can do?
Yeah, I mean, definitely get involved in the different campaigns that are here. One of the, I guess, key things that what happens in these talks, as I said, is a reflection of what's happening at national level. So whilst it's important to follow what's happening here, to put pressure on our governments, joining the campaign, for example, for fossil-free politics, it's, and kick polluters out. We've got a campaign, kick polluters out. It's really important that back home, people are trying to hold their governments to account. Back home, people are fighting back, because this is where power comes from. We need that power in the streets, and it's built from the bottom up. It's built from our communities. It's not going to be built at the UNFCCC. The UNFCCC will also be a reflection of our power. How much power have we built at national level? So there are huge campaigns around solutions, around community and renewable energy, around agroecology with La Via Campesina, around different ways of doing things. I mean, that's, seeing the Buen Vivir and what's coming out of Bolivia and the demands being made there. All around the world, there's incredible examples of alternative ways of living, of tackling climate change, of dismantling this sort of neoliberal capitalist system, dismantling corporate power. So it's about supporting, I guess, these campaigns, these organizations. And please go on our website. We have lots of it. Check out our Twitter, our Facebook. We constantly have sort of petitions happening, letters, actions, all sorts of things, and would love support. And one of the core things is it's actually just education. We need this awareness raising, we need political education, and people to believe both that change is possible, that they are part of that change. So this is sort of what we try and do. We try and be part of that political education, and try and work with trade unions, social movements, left-wing political parties to build power. And this is, I can't say it enough, this is the key thing that we need to do in order to sort of try and shift the dynamics here at the UN level. And that means building power at national level, at local level. So I'd say that.
That's a great wrap up. So thanks so much, Pascoe Sabido. You've got things to do, places to go, people to annoy. So good luck with that. And stay tuned, and please come back to CorpWatch for other information. We'll put up some links and the blog posts so people can learn more about Corporate Europe Observatory's work on this. And of course, you can go to this link right here. So thanks again, and we'll catch up again soon.
Cool. Take care.